Kia ora tato, and thank you, Greg. And I am not aging, and the reason for that is there's too much going on, there's too much coming down the track. I often feel like I'm the youngest person in the room, so we'll see how we go in that. Kia ora tato again. The word concern in your name can either be interpreted as worry or as care and value in the well-being of this expanding cohort of aging people. And that generates, if we take it that way, generates opportunity, not just for those people, but for the whole of society. So where will Aotearoans New Zealanders choose to fix our focus for the 2020s? Fixing a problem or realising opportunity? Well, right now, most people would see a problem, and that fits in the gloomy cast that is set in liberal democracies like ours. Yet, as philosopher Steven Pinker points out, life has actually got better for humans across the globe through the past 2 centuries and on through the past 2 decades. Only a minority now live in extreme poverty, compared with the great majority 200 years ago, and that minority continues to shrink. We can fix many of the afflictions that used to kill us humans, and so we live far longer. Per head of population, there is less war and less violence. The list of life improvements continues to lengthen. So why are we gloomy? Steven Pinker points out correctly that over the past half century in liberal democracies like ours, the traditional media have focused increasingly not on what is going right, but on what goes wrong. And over the past decade or so, Twitter, Facebook, and other social media, marvellous outlets, have multiplied the spread of that bad news, including now in fake form. And we hear from politicians and bureaucrats and not-for-profits constant litanies of problems. And I thought from Tracy just before, she got away from problem into opportunity, and that's a plus. Well, that's the past and the present. Let's look out into the 2020s. They do promise to be an exciting decade. Now, excitement comes in 2 forms: frightening and exhilarating. And for all Steven Pinker's masses of evidence in support of his rosy, and I would say sometimes too rosy view, there is mounting evidence that 2020s will generate both sorts of excitement: fear and hope, good and bad disturbances and disruptions. We'll start with the global economy and global politics. Over the past half century, and particularly over the past quarter century, the global economy and politics have been rapidly rebalancing, and that rebalancing will continue through the 2020s. For 5 centuries, Europe and its offshoots lopsidedly dominated the world's politics, its economy, and its ideas, both of how things should be run and in new science and technologies. That domination is ending. We have to share with others and adjust and adapt and live with their different ways of thinking and their new science. Xi Jinping is reconstituting the Chinese Empire, which for 2 millennia or more, until the mid-19th century, saw itself as the centre of civilization, with a periphery of tributary states reaching across Central Asia and these days down to us via Southeast Asia. And this re-energized China, having fed off a liberal trading system to enrich its people, sees all Chinese as family, including those living elsewhere, and it aims to influence countries around it through that family, and to reshape global trading networks and by reconstituting the ancient Silk Roads through Central Asia to Europe, and establishing a strong sea presence around Southeast Asia and India to Africa and the Middle East. Xi's China is supplementing economic power with both soft political power, that includes loans to vassal states, and hard military power. It promotes an alternative to liberal democracy. And to Xi's west, on a lesser scale, Vladimir Putin is reconstituting the Russian Empire, and intervenes in neighbouring states and hacks into liberal democracies' voting systems and markets. These 2 empires are flexing their muscles at a time when northern liberal democracy, and we happen to be a southern one, are experiencing crises of identity and social cohesion after the living standards of large segments of their populations stalled or reversed under the impact of economic and demographic globalization and rebalancing. Hence Donald Trump and Britain's exit from the European Union, and many populist and other non-traditional forces across the European continent, notably Emmanuel Macron's in France, and the clown, Beppe Grillo's, five-star movement in Italy, which came first in the recent election. That is straining, and in some places has ended the post-1945 centre-left, centre-right dominance of liberal democratic political systems, which operated within fairly settled policies. And I've put all this, by the way, if you do want to, it's in greater length in this book, and there's some, there will be some, for those who really want to, some order forms on the desk later. Then you add in the turmoil in the Arab world, and this all comes as global issues needing global responses are rising, principally climate change, water, sea pollution, food source degradation, and pandemic diseases. If not addressed, these trending issues will disrupt human lives and social orders, potentially seriously. But because there is no global government, even to begin to address these global issues will require coalitions of the willing to take risks, set standards, and ferret out opportunity. The good news is that such coalitions can be not only states, but cities, companies, and non-government organisations, and there is growing evidence of such initiatives. Another global issue is digital technology, and this is deeply changing the way we live, as much as did the first industrial revolution from the 1770s, but multiple times faster. The world and its citizens are more directly and far more extensively connected to the extent that they want to be. This technology, it's built off science established in the 1940s, is now what experts call recombinant. Just as steam in the early 19th century and electricity in the early 20th century, where that is, as digital innovations spread, offshoots and new innovations emerge, which feed back in and add dimensions to the original technology. Well, as a result, artificial intelligence and robotisation will develop very fast in the 2020s, with effects on work and social order, which are only guessable at this point, but are likely to be profound and disorienting in addition to opening up opportunities. Just think of self-drive cars, fast, accurate prognoses and early diagnoses of medical conditions, robotic surgery, the gig and sharing economies, and much else. Those of an age to be of concern to age concern will not be cloistered from these changes. And the huge potential benefits of these new technologies will coexist uneasily with huge potential risks and damage. One issue will be how to ensure everyone has access to the benefits digital technology and especially artificial intelligence can bring, including, for example, for health, particularly for those who are less well off or are in remote places or are older or less able to adapt to newfangled machines. It will pose complex issues of privacy and dignity in the way personal information is collected, stored and used, even when it's collected for the benefit of those it is collected from. These issues will demand different responses from policymakers in the 2020s from those that have been fashionable in the 2010s, and different responses from the individuals supplying or using those technologies. Then there is gene editing, especially its 6-year-old form, CRISPR. This offers potentially huge benefits in improved plant growth and so expanded food production to meet the needs of the next 2 billion people due by 2060 or so, offsetting the huge upsets posed by climate change and related events. It offers huge benefits in treatment of bodily afflictions and the interruption of genetically transmitted diseases. It offers the possibility of designer babies and the potential for serious misuse by autocrats and crooks. The ethical issues CRISPR and its impending offshoots raise are of such mind-boggling complexity and novelty that the discoverer of CRISPR, Jennifer Doudna, told the New Scientist recently she began to worry in 2017 that she might be a modern Dr. Frankenstein. I hope I'm getting you excited, because there is much to be excited about, both in hope and in fear. And part of me wishes I was 23 again and could live to see where all this goes, and part of me is glad I'm not 23 and won't have to see where it all goes. But my daughter will live through those disruptions, and so will her son, my grandson. They and those of their age will be the people who would need to look out for the well-being of those who will enter their wonder years in the next 10 to 20 years. Age concern will need to look out those 10 to 20 years and plan for them if it is to be relevant to the well-being of those cohorts in their wonder years. Focus for a moment on that word, well-being. It has a special relevance right now. 3 years ago this month, Giro Karagioliou, then the Treasury's chief economist, sent me a draft of a working paper on the Treasury's Living Standards Framework. This working paper explored Amartya Sen's theory of well-being economics as applied to New Zealand conditions by academic economist Paul Dalzell. It rather surprised me to get such a document from the Treasury at the time. But as since developed by the Treasury, well-being economics aims to measure economic success by changes in the stocks of various capitals. And economists have long measured the ups and downs of financial and physical capital and scored the economy by how much output of market-priced goods and services was rising and falling. The Treasury now wants to measure changes in the stocks of natural capital, human capital, and social capital in order to widen its understanding of our true prosperity. This was spelt out both in its 4-yearly long-term fiscal forecasts in late 2016 and its 4-yearly investment statement last month. And that makes a lot of common sense. The economy is a subset of society. How well a society operates depends on the strength of our human capital, and humans can only exist if our natural capital, that's ecosystems and supplies of raw materials, is in good order and not run down. People don't measure prosperity only in stuff and dollars, but in a wide range of aspects of their lives. New Zealand comes out near the top of the world in a number of measures of this wider prosperity, for example that of the Legatum Institute and the OECD's Living Standards Index. The Labour-led government has enthusiastically adopted this well-being way of thinking about how to shape the economy. Jacinda Ardern and Grant Robertson warmed to the idea while in opposition, and Grant wants his 2019 budget to be a well-being budget. Jacinda has a bill in Parliament taking a step down that road by inserting into the Public Finance Act a requirement to measure and report on changes in child poverty. But whether the Treasury can actually lift Grant's fulfil Grant's 2019 wellbeing budget aim is very doubtful. To get meaningful measures of natural, human and social capital is mind-bogglingly difficult. There is a lot of international work on these matters, but they are far from settled. It might take a decade or more to get the sort of rigour that would measure up as guides to effective policy. So Jacinda Ardern and Grant Robertson will probably need a second term at least if the Treasury's initiative is to survive future political cynics. So far, a second term does look more likely than not. But focus on that word effective. Effective policy will be judged by whether investment of money extracted from taxpayers produces positive benefits for the individuals invested in, and as a result, positive benefits for the whole of society. Now, this criterion was gradually evolving under Bill English's social investment program, reinforced by the Treasury's CBAX test against evidence vetted by department's external science advisors, though the evolution had a long way to go when English was removed from office and he could not contemplate wellbeing economics. Well, another dimension to wellbeing economics is that the neoliberal or neoclassical or market liberal paradigm, which has been dominant in liberal democracies, including ours, since the 1980s, I call it the Friedmanite paradigm after Milton Friedman, its a paramount exponent, is in serious decay. There is no new paradigm on the shelf, however, waiting to be taken down and applied, just as there was no new paradigm on the shelf in the early decades of that first industrial revolution. Wellbeing economics is a step, not the whole journey, towards that new durable paradigm. But well-being can be a useful way to think about age concern, small a, small c. It could focus us on positives, not negatives, on opportunity, not problem. First, we might usefully be more specific about what we mean by age. 6 years ago, the assumption built into the early drafts of the Treasury's 2012 long-term fiscal forecast was that everyone over 65 was old, because 65 was the qualifying age for national superannuation. And that was despite evidence that increasing numbers were continuing to work for wages and salaries after 65, and evidence of lengthening life expectancies reaching into the upper 80s. I argued at the time that only those over 75 or so could in any real sense be called elderly or even old. Decrepitude or infirmity does not set in on the 65th birthday. That is not to say the national superannuation qualifying age must rise dramatically. My own solution is a means-tested pension from 65 to 70 and universal superannuation from 70, similar to the arrangement in the 1960s, which between 60 and 65. Differentiating between the over 65s and those a decade or more older would recognise that through the 2020s, more use could be made of over 65s in the workforce as the number of 18 to 64s falls relative to the number of over 65s, as Tracy Martin has been pointing out. And so in theory, the burden, in quote marks, of supporting the old and elderly falls more heavily on a smaller proportion of population. Also, more over 65s will have to work to make ends meet. The ageism now embedded in HR thinking is out of date and verging on irresponsible. HR for the 2020s would identify the value in the over 65s. That's opportunity. That's positive age concern. There will need to be some other rethinking. One is the role of KiwiSaver and other earnings life saving schemes for those now under 50 to supplement their national superannuation. Expanding those schemes would mean relatively more SAGO, that's save as you go, in addition to the heavy reliance at the moment on PAYGO, pay as you go, and that in turn requires serious rethinking of tax, which now discriminates against saving, as Andrew Coleman has shown. And another candidate for rethinking is education. There is a growing line of thinking that the heaviest focus needs to be on the years 0 to 8, emphasise 0, and that the focus needs to be on building non-cognitive skills to deal with a much less settled work lives. That would include being better geared to imbibe the necessary cognitive skills, not just in school and post-school, but multiple times during a much more differentiated and often fragmented work life than the 20th century factory education system efficiently schooled us for. That includes, importantly, those over 65 who want or need to work on. Those cognitive skills will need to be delivered in much more consumer need ways than now, including in precisely targeted modules. We might also usefully aim to imbue wider and more appropriate non-cognitive skills in managers. To do this, different educating will require valuing the educators far more as professionals, including far higher pay and status, and on the other side of that ledger, far higher professional qualifications and effectiveness on the job. We will also, I've yet to see that really come through in the thinking of the current government, but it might. We will also need to make as much use as we can of everyone 18 and over. Right now, we in effect discard many children because we don't make up for the defective very early childhood experiences in a rising number of households. Richie Poulton's ongoing 45-year-long longitudinal study of a Dunedin cohort born in the 1972-1973 has provided compelling evidence that the earlier we start, the more valuable the results. It has also demonstrated the value of early development of non-cognitive skills, such as self-control, in making the best of one's life. Getting that right would make a big contribution to long-term well-being. Well, how is that of concern to people of concern to age concern? The simple answer is that by doing right by children, doing right by children will over time contribute to a more cohesive society. As I see it, a cohesive society is infrastructure to be invested in and maintained. And I would argue that those of an age to be of concern to age concern are those most likely to benefit from a cohesive society. And a critical contributor to social cohesion are not-for-profits like age concern. Well, not-for-profits supplement taxes by tapping the public's goodwill in money and time, and so expand the total services available. But that's not all. They have detailed knowledge of the individuals whom they serve. They can identify gaps and fill them. And most important, they can be flexible and innovative. And to do social services well needs innovation, especially in changing times. And as I've argued, the 2020s are likely to be truly changing times, requiring highly innovative responses. Well, Bill English recognised the potential for innovation by not-for-profits early in his time as Finance Minister, but he left them tied up in multi-dozen-page contracts, often covering narrow slices of what they do, and often needing annual renewal. And that is no way to ensure there can be innovation, at least in the services the government pays for or part pays for. That is not the way to go into the 2020s. If the government is to get innovative services, the 2020s will demand, the innovative services the 2020s will demand, it will need to take risks, either itself or by giving its staff space and backing to innovate, and or by backing not-for-profits at part funds to innovate. Interestingly, Jacinda Ardern told public service chiefs last week she wants them to take risks, though not to be reckless. Perhaps she means it and will tough out the noisy politics when enterprises go wrong. Jacinda Ardern's resolve, and that of her ministers, has yet to be tested. If risk-taking is to be encouraged, the contracts with not-for-profits will need drastic revision. But there is an opening for enterprising not-for-profits, and that opening includes reformulating structures and operations to be relevant for the 2020s, and if necessary, to be able to keep reformulating them as the 2020s evolve. Can age concern seize those opportunities? Is it flexible and innovative enough to be relevant to those of an age in the 2020s and the different lives they will live in different times? That's your concern.